The stamp. The first time I held my own signature in my hands, I didn't recognize it. Not because it was faded. Because it was forged, pressed onto a document that could send me to prison for something I never did, sitting on my mother-in-law's desk like it had always belonged there. Sign the top copy too, Diane said, not even looking up from her coffee. For your file. I want you to hear what she was actually asking. 12 hours earlier, a man named Rick Delgado had fallen through scaffolding that should have held 4 times his weight. He was in the ICU with 2 fractured vertebrae, and doctors weren't sure yet if he'd walk his daughter down the aisle in June like he'd been telling everyone at the site for a year. The scaffolding failed because someone had gutted the safety margins to save 9 days on a deadline. And the paperwork that made that decision look approved, look signed off, look like a licensed engineer had checked it and said this will hold had my name on it. My actual signature was 3 weeks and 1 folder away, sitting in my car, on the real drawings. The ones that said this is not safe, do not proceed. Someone had taken my name off that folder and put it on this one instead. So let me ask you something. Right now, before I go any further, if the difference between you're fine and you go to prison came down to 1 signature, and someone else's hand had already written it for you, how fast do you think you could prove which hand was really yours? Because that's the position I was standing in. Not family drama. Not hurt feelings. A federal offense with my name on it, in a building my husband's family had owned since 1961, while a man I'd worked beside for 2 years lay in a hospital bed, not knowing if he'd feel his legs when he woke up. This is the kind thing to do, Diane said. For everyone, kind. She used that word while a stamp bearing my license number, the seal that legally means I am responsible for this, if it fails on me, sat on a set of drawings. I had flagged as dangerous and refused, in writing, to approve. I picked up the pen. I'm not going to lie to you and say I was strong in that moment. For about 4 seconds, my hand actually moved toward the paper. 4 years of being told I didn't understand how this family worked, that gratitude was the entrance fee, that if I just stayed quiet a little longer I'd finally be one of them, all of it pressed down on my wrist like another hand on top of mine, guiding it. Then I thought about Rick. About his daughter's wedding. About the fact that somewhere in a hospital 40 minutes away, a man was breathing through a tube because someone in this family had decided a schedule mattered more than a life, and they were about to make it look like it was my fault. I put the pen down. I want a copy of this, I said. For my file. Diane's expression didn't crack, but something behind her eyes recalibrated the look of someone realizing a piece of furniture she'd owned for years had just, for the first time, refused to move where she pushed it. She had no idea what that 4-second refusal was going to cost her. I didn't know it yet either, not that 7 months later I'd be standing under the chandeliers of the very building this company was built to construct, holding my real license stamp in one hand, and a cracked coffee mug from Rick's job site in the other, in front of investors, a reporter who thought she was covering a company anniversary, and the family that had just tried to make a paralyzed man's injury disappear into my name. I didn't know that yet. All I knew, standing in that office with a forged version of myself on the desk between us, was this. They had just tried to trade my future for their son's mistake, and I was about to spend the next 7 months making absolutely sure that trade never went through. I should back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what I walked into 4 years earlier, back when Ashgrove Construction was still just a name stamped on half the water towers and school gymnasiums in Courland, Ohio, and I still thought marrying into a family business meant I'd have a family. I met Marcus in a materials science lecture. I was auditing my last year of grad school. He asked me, completely seriously, whether I thought post-tension concrete was underrated as a romantic subject, and I laughed so hard I knocked over my coffee. That's the kind of husband he was for a long time. Curious. A little awkward. The kind of man who remembered which bridge failure I found most interesting, the Tacoma Narrows. For the record, because resonance is the only kind of collapse that looks almost beautiful while it's happening, and brought it up 2 years later like it mattered to him because it mattered to me. When we got married, his mother hugged me at the reception and said, "We don't lose engineers in this family. We keep them." I thought that was sweet. I didn't understand yet that keep was the operative word, and it wasn't a metaphor about affection. It was a plan. I joined Ashgrove Construction 8 months later as a project engineer. Not because Diane offered me a job, because I applied for one, the normal way, competing against 2 outside candidates who were, on paper, equally qualified. I got it because I was good. And I want that on the record, because later they tried very hard to make it sound like charity. For 3 years I did the actual math that keeps buildings standing. Load calculations, deflection tolerances, The parts of construction nobody photographs for the company newsletter? I liked it. I liked that a beam either holds or it doesn't. That concrete cures at a rate you can predict down to the hour. That in my corner of the world, the truth doesn't care who you're married to. I should have known that wouldn't last, because the rest of the company didn't run on that logic. It ran on Diane. Diane Ashgrove had been the company's COO for 11 years by the time I arrived, though everyone in Courland, including 3 sitting city council members, understood her as something closer to the company's spine. Her husband, Marcus's father, had died young, and instead of the business folding the way people expected, Diane had folded herself into every joint of it until you couldn't find the seam between Diane Ashgrove and Ashgrove Construction. She had a way of saying we that included the company, the family, and the town in one breath, so that disagreeing with her felt, structurally, like disagreeing with all 3. There's a photograph in the family conference room I want to tell you about, because it matters later. It's black and white, from 1961. Marcus's grandfather standing in front of the company's first completed building, a modest 3-story office block that's now a dry cleaner's. The bottom right corner of the photo is faintly scorched, a small brown curl of damage no bigger than a thumbprint. Nobody in the family has ever explained it to me. I asked Marcus once and he shrugged and said, "It's just always been like that." 4 years. And not one person in that family had the curiosity or the nerve to find out how a picture in a climate-controlled office got burned. I think about that photograph more than I probably should. A whole family, generation after generation, walking past a small scorched wound every single day and agreeing, without ever discussing it, not to look at it too closely. That was Ashgrove Construction in one image, long before I understood it. There was a smaller sign, too, one I noticed early, and dismissed as harmless, the way you dismiss a hairline crack in a foundation you haven't been trained to take seriously yet. Every project the company completed got a small brass plaque near the entrance, engraved with the year and the words, Ashgrove Construction, a family that builds. Not the names of the engineers, not the names of the crews who poured the concrete or the safety inspectors who signed off on it. Just the family name, standing in for every hand that had actually done the work. I remember pointing this out to Marcus once, early in our marriage, half joking, asking where my name went if I designed something. He'd smiled and said, "You'd be part of the family that built it. That's the name." I believed him. It took me 3 more years to understand that being folded into the family that built it was never going to be the same as being credited for what I had actually built, and that the difference between those 2 things was exactly the gap Diane needed to stay wide enough to walk through whenever it suited her. I want to give you one ordinary night, because if I only tell you the bad ones, you won't understand what I actually lost, and losing it is the reason I fought as hard as I did. It was a Tuesday in April, over a year before any of this started. Marcus made pasta badly, the way he always did, with too much garlic and not enough salt, and we ate it standing at the counter because the dining table was covered in my structural drawings for a warehouse retrofit. He read my calculations over my shoulder, not because he understood them. Materials science was his father's dream for him, not his own, but because he liked watching me work. At some point, he put a dish towel over my eyes and told me I looked tired and needed 10 minutes of darkness, and I laughed and told him that was the least scientific prescription I'd ever heard, and we stood in the kitchen with cold pasta getting colder. Not talking about work. Not talking about his mother, just 2 people who liked each other. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for what came apart. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that Marcus wasn't born the man who stayed silent. Something built that man slowly, over years, the same way you build a structural failure, not with one bad day, but with load after load after load. Nobody bothered to recalculate. The first crack, and I mean that as precisely as I mean anything, showed up 14 months before Rick Delgado fell. Tyler, Marcus's younger brother, had been made VP of Operations the year before, a title that in most companies means something, and in this one meant Diane had run out of ways to keep him occupied without giving him a business card. Tyler was likable in the specific way of men who have never had to be anything else. He called every subcontractor buddy. He was, by any honest measure, not good at his job, and everyone in that building knew it, and nobody said it, because saying it required saying something true about Diane's favorite son, which required, by extension, saying something true about Diane. The project was a mid-rise mixed-use building on Ferris Street, 4 stories, retail on the ground floor, apartments above, standard work. I'd done the structural drawings myself, stamped them with my own hands, felt that small private satisfaction. I still got every time 6 years of school and exams, and here it was, proof, my name meaning something on paper, 3 weeks into construction. Tyler decided the schedule was too tight. He didn't come to me. He went around me, to a subcontractor, and had the shoring specifications for the second floor slab quietly reduced, fewer support posts, wider spacing, to save time on formwork. I found out because I walked the site on a Thursday afternoon and counted the posts myself, the way I always did, the way 6 years of training had taught me never to trust a report I hadn't verified with my own eyes. I counted 11 posts where the drawing called for 19. I want you to sit with that number for a second, because numbers are the only thing in this story that never lied to me. 11 instead of 19 isn't a rounding error. It isn't an interpretation. It's a decision, made by a man with a title, and no license, to gamble with a load-bearing calculation he did not understand, in order to save 9 days. I flagged it that same afternoon, in writing, to Tyler, to the site supervisor, and, out of what I still believed at the time, was ordinary professional courtesy, to Diane. Diane's response came the next morning, in her office, over coffee she did not offer me. "You're new to how families run things here," she said. "I want that sentence to stand alone for you, the way it stood alone for me in that office, because she never elaborated on it, and she never needed to. It wasn't a rebuttal. It wasn't even really directed at the 11 posts. It was a boundary marker, planted calmly, telling me exactly which kind of employee she expected me to be from that point forward. The kind who reports a problem exactly once, and then remembers her place. I did not remember my place. I went back the next day and recounted. Still 11. I want to tell you I raised hell, filed something official, refused to sign off. The truth is messier, and I think the messiness matters more than a clean story would. I got the posts added back quietly, by going directly to the site supervisor, a woman named Paulette Grier who had been pouring concrete for this company for 26 years and had absolutely no patience for Tyler Ashgrove. Paulette didn't say much about it. She just nodded once, added the posts herself over a weekend on her own initiative, and told me, months later, almost in passing, that her granddaughter had a swim meet that same Saturday she lost to fixing Tyler's shortcut, and she'd missed watching the girls' first ever first-place finish because of it. She told me this without bitterness, just as a fact of her life, the kind of detail that reminded me, and I wanted to remind you too, that every person standing in the blast radius of this family's carelessness had an entire life happening outside of it, one Diane Ashgrove never had to think about, because she never had to think about anyone's Saturday but her own. Ferris Street held. Nobody got hurt. And because nobody got hurt, nobody in that family learned anything at all. That's the part people get wrong about families like this. They don't learn from near misses. They learn that near misses are proof they were right to cut the corner in the first place. 14 months later, on a Wednesday morning in October, Tyler did it again. Different site, different shortcut. This time it was scaffolding on the exterior of a 3-story renovation on Delacroix Avenue. And this time nobody caught it in time, because this time Tyler had learned exactly one lesson from Ferris Street: not to be more careful, but to stop routing decisions through anyone who might notice. Rick Delgado was on the 3rd level of that scaffolding at 7:40 inches the morning when it gave way under a load it had never been rated to carry. He fell 22 feet. 2 fractured vertebrae, a shattered wrist, and for 11 days, while doctors ran tests, a real open question about whether he would walk again. I found out at 8:15 that morning, standing in my kitchen with a piece of toast halfway to my mouth, when Paulette called me directly instead of going through the usual channel, because Paulette, in her own words, wasn't going to let this family bury it before breakfast. I drove to the site instead of the hospital, which I know sounds cold, and I understand if it sounds cold to you too, but I am an engineer, and the only thing I know how to do with helplessness is turn it into a question I can actually answer. I needed to know why the scaffolding failed before I let myself feel anything about the fact that it had. That's where I met Des Okafor. Des was 26, a site safety engineer Ashgrove had hired 8 months earlier, young enough that he still believed job titles meant what they said. He was standing at the base of the collapsed scaffolding with a tablet in his hand, photographing the failure points before anyone could clean up the scene, which I want you to notice this, because it matters, is not a normal instinct for a 26-year-old on his first job out of a state safety certification program. Most people that age are worried about getting blamed. Des was worried about the truth surviving the next 20 minutes. "The load calcs on this section don't match what's in the permitted set," he said to me, before I'd even introduced myself properly, holding the tablet out so I could see. I pulled the file from the county office this morning because our copy looked off to me. I looked at his screen, and then I looked at the tablet in my own bag. At the drawing set I'd stamped myself 4 months earlier, and I understood. in the space of about 6 seconds, that the version on file with the county, the version that was now going to be examined by an OSHA investigator, by Ashgrove's insurance carrier, and eventually by a state licensing board was not the version I had drawn. Someone had reduced the rated capacity notation on the scaffold connection points. Someone had done it after my stamp was already on the page, which meant either the document had been physically altered after the fact, or a second, falsified version had been generated and filed in its place, carrying my seal without my knowledge. I want to give you the number here, because this is the moment the story stops being a feeling and becomes a fact you can hold on to. Between the drawing set on my laptop, time-stamped the day I signed it, and the version filed with Cortland County, there were 4 discrepancies. 4 separate values, each one weakening the structure's rated capacity, each one small enough that a casual read wouldn't catch it, each one large enough, in combination, to be the difference between a scaffold holding a man's weight and a scaffold folding under it. 4 numbers, 1 man in an ICU, and my seal, my name, my license, the thing I had built for 6 years to mean something sitting at the bottom of the page that made it look legal. Des didn't say anything dramatic. He's not that kind of person, and honestly, neither am I. He just looked at me for a second, and then he said, quietly, I kept the original file on a personal drive before anyone told me to send it up the chain. I don't know why. Felt wrong not to. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the months since. Felt wrong not to. Not a plan. Not heroism. Just one 26-year-old's stubborn, unglamorous decision to keep a copy of the truth before anyone had the chance to erase it. I didn't know it yet. Standing at that scaffold with toast I never finished still somehow in my coat pocket. But that decision, his, not mine, was the entire foundation everything else would be built on. I went to Diane's office that afternoon, expecting, I'll admit, that this would be different. A man was in the ICU. Surely this crossed a line even she respected. It did not. We're handling it, she told me, in the calm, closed-door voice she used for problems she considered beneath discussion. Legal is drafting a statement. The family is being taken care of. I need you to stay out of the county's way on this. The drawing on file isn't mine, I said. Someone altered load values after I stamped it. She looked at me for a long moment, and here's the sentence I want you to remember, because I've turned it over in my head more times than any other single thing that woman ever said to me. Noemi, you signed off on that project. Whatever's on file is on file because of a decision that was made a long time ago, by people who were trying to keep this company standing. I'd think very carefully before I decided this was the hill. I want to point something out. She never denied it. She never said, that's not what happened, you're mistaken. She said I should think carefully before choosing this as my hill to die on. A woman who runs a company doesn't threaten you like that unless she already knows exactly which hill it is, and exactly how far she's prepared to bury you on it. That was 6 days before she put the resignation letter on her desk with my forged signature already on it. In between, I did something I'm not proud of and not ashamed of either. I went quiet, publicly quiet. I stopped raising the issue in meetings. I let Diane believe the flicker she'd seen in my eyes that day. The 4 seconds where my hand had moved toward the pen meant I'd folded. What I actually did, in that quiet, was start building a file of my own. I want to walk you through this carefully, because it's the part of the story that actually took the longest, even though it's the part people skip past to get to the ending. For 7 weeks, I copied every drawing revision I could access, time-stamped, with metadata intact, onto a drive that never touched the company network. I asked Paulette, without ever fully explaining why, to keep her own dated notes on the Ferris Street posts, on Tyler's habit of routing decisions around me, on every small thing she'd watched happen over 26 years that she'd always assumed wasn't her business to mention. She started keeping those notes in a marbled composition notebook she bought at a drugstore, the kind kids use for homework, and every time I saw that notebook in her bag I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite hope, but was standing close enough to it. I met Des twice, always outside the building. Once in his car in a grocery store parking lot with the engine off, so we could talk without the heater, masking our voices on a cold night, and he handed over the untouched copy of the Delacroix scaffold drawings on a flash drive he'd kept. He told me, in the same drawer as his daughter's old school photos, because it felt, in his words, like something worth keeping safe. That detail has stayed with me. A man I barely knew, protecting the truth in the same drawer where he kept pictures of his little girl growing up. I think about what that says about which things a person decides, instinctively, belong in the same category of sacred. I also went to a lawyer. Not Ashgrove's lawyer, my own. A woman named Priya Bhatt who specialized in professional licensing defense and who, on our first call, Ask me exactly one question that reframed the entire 7 months for me. Do you want to survive this? Or do you want the truth to survive this? Because those aren't always the same strategy, and I need to know which one we're building. I told her both. She told me that was the harder path, and she was right, and I'd do it again. Here's where I need to tell you about Marcus, because I've been putting it off the same way I put it off in real life, and I think that delay says something true about how these discoveries actually happen. They don't arrive all at once. They arrive in pieces you keep declining to assemble, because assembling them means admitting something you can't take back. It was a Sunday, about 5 weeks after Delacroix, and I was at the kitchen table with my laptop, cross-referencing dates on the altered drawing files against internal email timestamps, when Marcus came in, saw my screen, and went very still in a way I'd never seen him go still before. Not surprised. Still. Recognizing. Still. You're building a case against my mother, he said. Not a question. I'm building a case for what actually happened, I said. There's a difference, if you're on the right side of it. He sat down across from me, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all, and I watched him not say it, and something in my stomach dropped the way it does right before you already know the number on the scale isn't going to be the one you hoped for. I saw the revised drawing set before you did, he said finally. Tyler showed me. About a week before you found out. I didn't say anything. I've learned that silence, in the right moment, gets people to keep talking far more effectively than a question does. I told him it was a bad idea, Marcus said. I told him to fix it before anyone official saw it, but you didn't tell me. He looked at the table instead of at me. And here's the thing about Marcus's voice that I want you to understand. One of the 3 things I'd tell you define exactly how he talks when he's cornered. He never answers the question you actually asked. He answers a nearby one, a smaller one he can survive answering. You don't understand what it's like being the son who isn't the favorite and still needing the company to survive long enough for my inheritance to mean something. If this blows up the way you want it to, there might not be a company left for either of us. A man can't feel his legs, Marcus. I know that. His voice cracked slightly. The first real thing he'd said. I know that. I've thought about Rick every day. You thought about him, and you still didn't say anything for 5 weeks. He didn't answer that one either. He just sat there, and I sat across from him, and the dish towel he used to put over my eyes 1.5 years earlier was still hanging on the same hook by the stove, and I remember looking at it and understanding, with a clarity that honestly scared me more than Diane's threats ever had, that the man across from me hadn't lied to me outright, not once, in the entire 5 weeks. He had just decided, quietly, privately, that his mother's company and his own eventual inheritance were worth more than telling his wife a fact that could have changed how carefully I protected myself from the very beginning. That's not the same as forging a signature. I need to be fair about that, because fairness is the only thing that makes this story mean something instead of just feeling good. Marcus never touched those drawings. Marcus never told anyone to file the false version with the county, but Marcus knew. And Marcus watched me walk into that resignation letter meeting 5 weeks after he'd learned the truth, without a single word of warning, because warning me might have required choosing a side before he was ready to. I didn't leave that night. I want to be honest about that too, because I don't think leaving immediately would have been more true than what I actually did, which was quieter and, I think, harder. I kept building the file. I let him watch me do it. I stopped explaining my evenings to him, and somewhere in the silence that grew between us at that kitchen table, I understood that whatever came out of the next 2 months, our marriage was not going to come out of it looking the way it went in, and that this, not the scaffolding, not the forged signature, was the fact I was going to have to live with longest. I want to tell you about the second time I met Des in that grocery store parking lot, because it's the moment I understood he wasn't helping me out of loyalty to me. He barely knew me, but out of something closer to his own private code. It was late, the store nearly empty, carts rattling somewhere behind the building in the wind. Before he handed over the flash drive, he sat for a second, with his hand still resting on it, and told me, almost apologetically, that his daughter had asked him that week why he kept coming home late, and he hadn't known how to explain it to a 7-year-old without either lying to her or scaring her. I told her I was helping make sure a building doesn't fall down, he said. She asked which building. I said I didn't know yet. That felt like the most honest answer I had. He laughed a little after he said it, not because it was funny, but because I think laughing was the only thing he had left to do with a sentence that true. I didn't know Des well before Delacroix, and I don't see him often now, but I think about that 7-year-old's question more than almost anything else from those 7 months. Which building? Because in the end, that was really the only question that ever mattered to either of us. Not which family, not which company. Which building? Whether it stands? I want to give you one night that had nothing to do with any of this. Because if I don't, you'll start to think I turned into a machine somewhere in those 7 months. And I didn't. Not entirely. It was a Thursday in December, and I drove 40 minutes out of Cortland just to sit in a diner by myself and eat a plate of eggs at 9 at night, because I needed 1 hour where nobody in that family could reach me, and nothing on my laptop needed cross-referencing. The waitress, a woman probably close to Paulette's age, refilled my coffee without asking and told me, unprompted, that her son was getting married in the spring, and she still hadn't decided on a dress. I don't know why I remember that detail so specifically. I think I remember it because for 1 hour, in a vinyl booth under bad fluorescent light, I got to be a person listening to a stranger talk about a dress, instead of a woman quietly assembling a case against her own family. I needed that hour more than I understood at the time. I think everyone carrying something heavy needs at least 1 hour like that, or the weight stops being something you're carrying and starts being something you've become. There was one night, near the end of January, that I want to walk you through slowly, because everything before it happened, at the speed of an ordinary life interrupted by something terrible, and everything after it happened because of what I decided in the space of about 11 minutes, alone, in a parked car outside a grocery store. I just left the meeting where Diane confirmed the gala invitation representing the next generation of Ash Grove engineers, and I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, because I didn't trust myself to drive yet. The parking lot lights had just come on, that particular orange that makes everything look slightly underwater. I had Rick's mug in the cup holder, the crack running along its base in a hairline I'd traced with my thumb so many times by then I could have drawn it from memory. I picked it up and turned it once in my hands. Not drinking from it, it had been empty for weeks. I just hadn't been able to throw it out, and I thought about how a hairline crack like that doesn't fail all at once. It weakens with every cycle of hot and cold, every small stress nobody's watching for, until one day it's carrying a load it was never rated for and it simply gives, and everyone standing nearby acts shocked, as if the crack hadn't been visible the entire time to anyone who'd bothered to look. I set the mug down. I opened my phone and looked, for a long time, at a folder, labeled nothing. I'd deliberately never named it anything that would explain itself to a casual glance, containing 4 altered load values, 1 composition notebook photographed page by page, 1 preserved drawing file from a flash drive kept in a drawer beside a little girl's school photos, and 1 legal memo written by a woman who had asked me, on our first call, whether I wanted to survive this or wanted the truth to survive it. I thought about signing the resignation letter that night in Diane's office, the 4 seconds my hand had actually moved. I thought about how easy it would have been to keep being the version of myself that letter wanted, quiet, grateful, kept, the way Diane had promised at my wedding reception the family would keep me, back when I still believed that was a kindness and not a plan. I thought about Rick's voice on the phone, glad I wasn't wrong about that, and about how much of my life I had spent needing someone, anyone, to say a sentence like that to me, and how strange it was that the man whose spine I'd helped put back together with the truth was the one who finally said it. I did not cry in that parking lot, though I want to be honest that I came close, and I don't think coming close would have meant anything different about what I decided. What I actually did was smaller than crying and, I think now, more important. I texted Priya 4 words, "I'm doing the gala," put the phone face down on the passenger seat, and drove home to make dinner, because somewhere in those 11 minutes I understood that the decision wasn't going to arrive as a single dramatic conviction. It was going to arrive the way the crack in that mug had quietly, already made, waiting only for me to notice it was finished. By February, I had what I needed. 4 altered load values, time-stamped against the original file Des had preserved. Paulette's notebook, with dates going back 14 months, documenting Tyler's pattern of routing safety decisions around licensed staff. Priya's legal memo, laying out, in language far colder than mine, exactly how a falsified engineering seal on a permitted document exposed not just Tyler and Diane, but potentially the entire firm, to criminal liability that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with them. And the original Delacroix drawing set, my real signature intact, dated 3 weeks before the file the county actually had on record. I also had one more thing, which I hadn't planned for and which mattered more than any spreadsheet. Rick Delgado, out of the hospital by then, walking with a cane but walking, had called me directly, on a number Paulette gave him, to ask if it was true that his fall showed up on paperwork with my name attached to it. I told him the truth. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I still think about. "I always figured you were the one person over there who actually checked things twice. Glad I wasn't wrong about that." I hadn't realized, until that phone call, how much I needed one person from that job site to say, out loud, that my carefulness had been real and visible, even when it hadn't been enough to stop what happened to him. The company's 63rd anniversary gala had been on the calendar for over a year, the kind of event Diane treated as a load-bearing pillar of the business itself, because in a town like Courland, a company's reputation is not a marketing exercise. It's the actual collateral the bank lends against. Investors were coming in from Columbus. A reporter from the regional business paper, a woman named Farah Liu, who Diane assumed was there to write 600 words about 63 years of steady leadership, had confirmed attendance. And 2 weeks before the event, Diane's assistant called to ask if I would give a short remark on stage, representing the next generation of Ash Grove engineers. I want you to sit with the audacity of that request for a second, the way I had to sit with it in my car for a full 10 minutes before I could make myself drive home. She was going to put me on a stage, in front of the exact people whose confidence her company depended on, to prove visually, publicly that the family was united, that the forged signature had never happened, that I was, and had always been, a loyal Ashgrove. I said yes. I'm not going to pretend the next 2 weeks were calm. Priya and I went over the sequence of what I could legally say without opening myself up to a defamation claim so many times I could recite her cautions in my sleep. Des agreed. After several conversations where I could hear him weighing his own career against what felt right to him, to stand at the back of the room with the original file loaded on a laptop, ready if I needed technical confirmation from someone other than myself. Paulette, when I told her what I was planning, closed her composition notebook, looked at me for a long moment, and said only, "About time somebody in a nice dress finally said something true in that ballroom." Then she asked if she could come. I told her she'd more than earned a seat. The night of the gala, the Ashgrove building's original ground floor, the same lobby from the 1961 photograph, the scorched corner and all, because someone, sometime, had actually reprinted and reframed that image at full size for the anniversary display, had been converted into a ballroom with white tablecloths and a string quartet that couldn't quite compete with 200 people talking at once. I stood near the edge of the room in a dress I'd bought specifically because it had pockets. Because I needed somewhere to keep my real engineering seal within reach all night. Its weight in my palm the entire time like a small, cold anchor. Diane found me near the bar an hour in, radiant in a way I hadn't seen since our wedding, and squeezed my arm. "Keep it short and warm," she said. "Something about family legacy. People love that." "I'll keep it accurate," I said. She laughed. "The way you laugh at something you've decided isn't a real threat." She had no idea. When Diane's assistant called my name to the small stage near the photograph wall, I walked up holding two things. My real stamp, and Rick's cracked coffee mug, which I'd carried in on a strap under my coat, because I needed something in the room that had actually been at Delacroix that morning, something that wasn't a slide or a statistic. I didn't give the speech Diane expected. I told the room, calmly, in the same voice I used to read out load calculations, that 4 discrepancies existed between the structural drawings I had personally stamped for the Delacroix Avenue project and the drawings currently on file with Courland County. I said the number twice, deliberately, the way Priya and I had planned it for, because a specific number lands differently in a room than an accusation does. I said that those 4 discrepancies were not clerical. I said that they were the reason a man named Rick Delgado spent 11 days not knowing whether he would walk again. The string quartet had stopped. I noticed that distantly, then the way you notice weather changing outside a window you're not looking through. I asked Des, at the back of the room, if he would confirm, for anyone who wanted to verify it themselves, that the original file existed and matched my personal copy exactly. He walked forward with his laptop, and in front of 200 people who had come expecting champagne and a nostalgic slideshow, he opened the untouched Delacroix file and set it beside a printed copy of the version filed with the county, so that anyone standing close enough could see, with their own eyes, the difference between 11 posts and 19, between the load values a licensed engineer had actually approved and the ones someone had quietly rewritten underneath her name. I took the stamp out of my pocket then, and I pressed it, once, cleanly, onto the printed copy of my original drawings, right there on the podium, in front of the photographers hired for the evening and the reporter who was no longer taking notes about legacy. I want to tell you that felt triumphant. What it actually felt like was closer to relief, the specific, physical relief of setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long your arms had started to shake without you noticing. Diane moved toward the stage, and for 1 second, in front of everyone, her composure actually broke not into anger, which I'd braced for, but into something smaller and, I think, more honest. Bewilderment. The look of a woman discovering that a piece of furniture she'd trusted her whole weight against for years had simply never been load-bearing in the way she assumed. "This is a family matter," she said, low enough that I don't think she meant the room to hear it, though the room heard it anyway. "You are airing a family matter in front of my investors." And here is the sentence she said next. The one I didn't plan for, the one that did more work than anything I had prepared, because I let it stand completely on its own, exactly the way it deserved to. "I built this company so my children would never have to answer to anyone. I am not going to let you turn my own family into the thing that finally makes us answer to somebody." Nobody needed me to explain what that sentence meant. 200 people in that ballroom heard a woman say, out loud, in front of a reporter, that avoiding accountability wasn't an unfortunate side effect of how she ran things. It was the entire founding purpose of the company as she understood it. Tyler pushed through the small crowd that had gathered near the stage, his tie already loosened. The way it got when he'd had one drink too many, before he had to be charming for a room. "You don't understand construction," he said to me. Loud enough to carry. "Nobody follows the drawings exactly. That's not how any of this actually works. 11 posts instead of 19 isn't an interpretation, Tyler," I said. "It's a number. I've never once seen you produce a number of your own. You've only ever adjusted mine." He didn't have an answer for that. Not really. He said something about deadlines, about pressure, about how easy it is to criticize from behind a desk, none of which addressed the 4 values on the page in front of him, because there was nothing in those 4 values that could be addressed. Numbers don't leave you anywhere to stand. Marcus came toward me last. And I want to tell you that part honestly, because it's the part I still turn over most. He didn't defend his mother. He didn't defend his brother. He stood close enough that only I could hear him and said, "I should have told you the day Tyler showed me." "Yes," I said. "You should have." "I was trying to protect," he started, and then he stopped himself, because I think even he heard, in real time, that he didn't have a version of that sentence's ending that wouldn't sound exactly as small out loud as it had sounded in our kitchen 5 weeks after Delacroix. He didn't finish it. He just stood there, in front of the scorched corner of his grandfather's photograph, looking at me the way you look at a beam once you finally understand it was never rated for the weight you'd been putting on it for years. It was an older man near the front, a Columbus investor named Arthur Whitlock, who I'd never met before that night and have only spoken to twice since, who said the one sentence I hadn't planned for and couldn't have written better myself. He looked at the printed drawing, at my stamp still wet on the page, and said, quietly enough that only the people near him heard, but clearly enough that Farah Lou wrote it down word for word, "That seal has her name on it, not the company's." I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Tyler, somewhere near the bar, had gone the color of the tablecloths. Marcus was standing near the photograph wall, close enough to the scorched 1961 corner that for one strange second the 2 damaged things were framed together, and he was looking at me with an expression I recognized because I'd worn it myself, 5 weeks earlier. At our kitchen table, the look of someone finally assembling pieces they'd spent a long time declining to put together. I'm not going to tell you the rest of that night unfolded like a movie, because it didn't. There was no applause. Several investors left within the hour, quietly, the way people leave a house when they've realized the foundation was never inspected the way they were told it had been. Farah Lou's article ran 9 days later, not as a puff piece about 63 years of steady leadership, but under a headline about falsified safety documentation at a family-run construction firm, and it named names, mine included, but named accurately, which was the only thing I had ever actually asked for. Here are the numbers, because I promised you numbers would matter, and I want to give you the ones on the other side of this too, the ones that measure what actually came apart instead of just what I felt. Ashgrove Construction lost 2 of its 4 largest active contracts within 6 weeks, worth, according to public filings, Priya later walked me through, just over $11 million combined. The state licensing board opened a formal investigation into the altered stamp within the month. Tyler was never licensed to begin with, so the board's authority reached him only through the criminal referral. Priya filed on my behalf, which resulted, 8 months later, in a plea agreement. Not the prison sentence some part of me had wanted in the ugliest, most honest corner of my anger, but a permanent bar from any construction management role requiring safety sign-off, plus restitution to Rick that Priya made sure was substantial. Diane stepped down as COO, 11 weeks after the gala, not resigning so much as being quietly, unanimously asked to by a board that no longer had the luxury of pretending her name alone still meant what it once had. She kept her ownership stake. She did not keep her office. One more number, because I think it matters more than the $11 million. 63 years, the age of the company at the time of the gala, was the number Diane had built her entire identity around, the one she'd used in every toast, every anniversary banner, every interview Farah Liu had originally planned to write. 11 weeks. That's how long it took after that number was said out loud on a stage for the board to decide 63 years of a name wasn't the same thing as 63 years of being trustworthy. I think about the gap between those two numbers more than I probably should, how long it takes to build a reputation, and how briefly it survives the moment someone finally checks the math. I never did find out, officially, what burned the corner of that 1,961 photograph, though I asked Diane once, months later, in one of the only conversations we've had since that wasn't through a lawyer. She told me it had happened during a small office fire in the 70s, before she'd even married into the family, and that Marcus's grandfather had refused to reframe it because he said a company should keep a mark of the one time it almost didn't survive, so nobody forgot how close that was. She said it like it explained something. I think it did, just not the thing she meant it to. A family that frames its own near collapse and hangs it on the wall, and then spends the next 50 years refusing to look directly at it, was never going to handle a real one any more honestly than they'd handled the small one. I think about that photograph still hanging in what used to be Diane's office, and I wonder whether anyone in that family will ever actually reframe it, or whether they'll just let it keep quietly reminding them of a lesson none of them, including me, fully learned in time. I don't tell you this to pretend it was a clean victory, because it wasn't, and I don't think stories like this are supposed to be clean. I want to tell you about the one moment, weeks later, when Diane called me not to apologize. She never quite managed that, not in any way I'd call whole, and said, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, "I don't know how to be someone people don't need to be protected from anymore." I sat with that sentence for a long time after I hung up. I still don't fully know what to do with it. I don't think she's a monster. I think she's a woman who was handed enormous, unaccountable power at a young age and never once, in 3 decades, had to develop a version of herself that didn't depend on it. That doesn't excuse what she did to Rick, or to me, or to the truth, but I've stopped needing her to be simple in order for what happened to be justified. Marcus and I are not divorced, and I'm not going to tell you we're fine either, because neither of those things would be true, and I promised myself, somewhere around the 4th month of building that file alone at my kitchen table, that I was done constructing versions of my life that were easier to say out loud than to actually live inside. He moved out for a while. He came back changed in some ways and exactly the same in others, the way people do when they've learned something true about themselves but haven't yet decided what to build with it. Some nights that feels like enough. Some nights it doesn't. I'm still doing the math on that one, and unlike a load calculation, I don't think this equation has a single correct answer waiting at the end of it. I started my own small structural consulting practice 4 months after the gala, mostly residential retrofits, and a handful of municipal contracts too small for firms like Ashgrove to bother with. It's slower work, and it pays less, and I have never once regretted it. Paulette retired the following spring, and gave me her composition notebook as a going-away gift, empty pages and all, which I think was her way of telling me to keep writing things down, because someone always should. Des left Ashgrove within the year and works now as a safety inspector for the county itself, the same office that once filed the falsified drawings without anyone catching it because, he told me once, over coffee, he'd rather be the person double-checking the file than the person hoping someone else remembers to. Rick walked his daughter down the aisle, that June, on a cane, slower than he'd have liked, but on his own legs. And he sent me a photograph from the reception that I still have saved, though I've never told anyone that, because I don't think it needs an explanation to mean what it means. And most mornings, even now, even though there's no professional reason for it anymore, I drive the long way to my office, so I pass the Delacroix building, finished now, occupied, ordinary, nobody living inside it aware of how close it came to being the site of a much worse story. I don't slow down, I don't need to. I just look up for the 2 or 3 seconds it takes to pass it. Check, the way 6 years of training taught me to check anything I've ever put my name on, and confirm, once again, that it's still standing exactly the way it was supposed to. I think that's the only ending this story was ever going to have. Not a hospital room, not a family dinner where everyone finally says the right thing. Just a building, holding the weight it was always supposed to hold, because someone finally insisted the numbers on the page matched the truth underneath them. So I'll leave you with the question I've been sitting with since the night I put that pen down instead of picking it up. How long would you keep quiet, doing everything right, waiting for someone to finally believe the truth on its own before you decided the only way anyone would ever believe you was to make them watch you prove it?